Supply Chain Talk, the live webinar with no presentations, no PowerPoint, just talk.
Good afternoon and welcome to this week's episode of Supply Chain Talk. My name's Alistair Charlton, your host this week. And our main topic is going to be reimagining warehouse material handling systems and distribution centres. But before we do that, we'll be talking about a topical news article. As a reminder, there's going to be a chat panel on the right of your screen, so do feel free to comment and ask any questions. And we'll try to get around to answering as many of those as we can. And there will be a Supply Chain Talk mug awarded to the contribution we find most useful for the afternoon. So without further ado, let me bring on my three guests. The first of these is Nanda Kishore, who's been on a few times, so some of you will have seen him before. He's head of global supply chain at Eramet Titanium and Iron AS, which is based in Norway. And Nanda has worked across heavy engineering, automotive, marine and renewable energy sectors, and he's an expert in lean manufacturing, quality management and the Internet of Things. So welcome, Nanda. My second guest is Vin Granger, who's Solutions Director with iForce. iForce is a leading third-party service provider specializing in e-commerce, fulfillment and returns. And Vin's been with iForce for around 19 years, and in recent years has been focused on the deployment of robotics, including Exotech's Skypod system and Locust bots. And before iForce, Vin spent 14 years with N. Brown and is an experienced the transition from a traditional mail order retailer, which it was then, to early adopter of e-commerce. So welcome, Vin. And finally, James Roberts is director at Randex Limited, and he has over 20 years experience of automated storage and retrieval solutions, helping clients implement the right solution for their changing businesses. And since 2008, James has worked at Randex, who provide ASRS systems and solutions across many sectors throughout the UK. So welcome, James. So our news article this week is from Supply Chain Digital, and it was from just last week, April 17th. By Sean Ashcroft, and it's headed up, as you can see, automation is easing the warehouse labour shortage, says Honeywell, and it talks about actually two trends. First of all, that urban warehouse capacity is in short supply in terms of property, but also the labour needed to staff those warehouses is also a real problem, and automation is something of a solution for both of those. And interesting statistic from the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport is mentioned, which is that 86% of organisations are experiencing staff shortages in warehousing. So that's pretty staggering that 86% of all organisations are having labour problems like that. The article says how a saving grace has been automation in that it can tackle labour shortfalls. And it talks about one or two of the leading technologies there. So certainly, in the UK, there's been a lot of coverage, I think, about warehouse shortages, property shortages, and labour shortages, partly through Brexit, partly through COVID, partly through other factors. Nando, how are things in Norway and Scandinavia? Are those problems for you over there?
Yeah, definitely. Both shortages are applicable. But when it comes to labor shortage, there is a reasonable amount of automation in the Scandinavian countries. So sort of that's compensating at many places, many sectors on the labor shortage. But the scarcity of warehouse space, that's growing because of one thing is increased e-commerce and international trade. The other thing is, of course, if you look at example of Norway where I live, the land available for development is not too large in our cities. We are so nature friendly, and you have lots of mountains and So, and then in addition, we have stricter rules coming from government for any new warehouse approvals. It's not so easy to get the warehouse approved because they have to qualify to certain regulations. So there is a scarcity of warehouse. So then we are looking at innovative solutions. Some retail space are being converted into storages, and now there are space sharing activities. So no longer are one warehouse confined to one customer. So we are looking at multiple customers within the warehouse. So there are trends to compensate. But this is an important thing for us here: the scarcity of warehouse space.
Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, very, very similar issues then, and the article actually talked about one solution being shared warehousing, where sort of obviously multiple customers share the same space. Vin, obviously you're into big warehouses rather than smaller urban ones, but are you seeing warehouse property shortages and labour shortages as big issues?
Less so now than obviously through COVID and sort of the last 18 months or so, but certainly we're experiencing issues that it's not so much shortage of labour per se, it's more of a shortage of the right skills when you need them at the right time. And that's the almost like the profile of normal commerce, let alone e-commerce, of how peaky and the troughs. So having the right number of people exactly at the right time is always the issue. Do you have people year round where you've got sunk cost, and do you pass that on to your clients? Well, that just doesn't work. So the main challenge is have you got the right number of people with the right skills at the point where you need them? And to some degree, that's the same with space, particularly where, let's say, a retailer's profile, they may bulk up for peak or bulk up for seasonal activity, seasonal trading, or they've got a good deal and they need to take on some stock. Then it's the same type of issue, that have you got the right amount of space at the right time? So yeah, absolutely an issue.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and it does remind us of sort of the classic supply chain sort of example, that ideally you want two customers, one of whom sells snow plows and the other one sells lawnmowers, and then you've got the perfect balance of demand. But most retailers need to sell at Black Friday and Christmas, so it doesn't help. James, obviously you'll love the fact that automation is suggested as the solution here. What are your thoughts on it all?
Yeah, I think automation is probably part of the solution, certainly. But in driving around the UK, you see, despite all the abundance of building that's going on in warehouse and big sheds, etc., most of the people we come across and the problems of space, lack of space and footprint in a warehouse, and looking to do whatever they can to increase capacity, whether that's vertical or looking at new buildings, etc. And then that in combination with the other problem they have, which is trying to find enough people, as you say, Vin, enough people to man the stations that they're trying to meet the demands they need to meet at the time they need to meet it, is a interesting problem for most companies, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Nanda, kind of, interested in the sort of, you're sort of commenting in Norway, which you think of being a pretty huge country with very few people. But as you point out, a lot of the country isn't so useful to build warehouses in. But equally, but I'm surprised that is urban logistics becoming a big thing? Is there big demand of people just wanting same day service, in the main cities, and which of course does put much more pressure on the supply chain?
Yes, yes and no. Yes, on the consumable goods, yes, the demand for services on the same day, that's increasing a lot. So there is a lot of traffic on the road for transportation of these goods, and of course, I think except a couple of cities, our highest speed limit is more or less around 60 to 70 kilometers per hour.
Nice.
Then you can imagine the amount of traffic on the road. But there are also a bullwhip effect, I could say, in terms of recovering from the COVID situation. So most of us are aware that during COVID, there was a lot of control on capex and maintenance budgets on most manufacturing industries. So thereby they sort of postponed or delayed their maintenance and overhauling programs. And all of a sudden, everybody needs the parts and everybody is up and running. They are having the maintenance plan and they need the parts forthwith. So that's increasing a lot of logistics cost and also traffic within the country. So there you can see most of the time we have these goods being transported, and then we have to be more sustainable. We talk about ESG requirements. We talk about carbon emissions. One side, and other side we want parts like immediately.
Yes.
So it's quite challenging, and it's fun to be in the supply chain space, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's certainly changing and challenging times. And Vin, obviously, you do an awful lot of work in iForce, has a lot of clients in the retail and e-commerce space. Are you seeing more demand for urban logistics? Is that forming part of your supply chains? Are you delivering products to small local urban depots to then be taken to the final customer, or are you mostly directly?
That's interesting. As we start to work with far more smaller types of clients. So as opposed to the big sort of high street retailers, there's lots of small two-man bands joining up. And what they're asking for is sort of local fulfillment. So rather than a big shed or even a 200,000 square foot shed, it's, can I have some of my stock in Newcastle? Can I have some in Manchester? Can I have some in London? And it's that speed to market, that speed of delivery that's now starting to grow for a smaller number of smaller retailers these days. But that population is starting to grow, and the types of clients that we're starting to work with more and more over this last 18 months fits in that category. And there's definitely a shift away from the big retailer who wants to launch online, because most big retailers have done that already. And it's now more a case of small retailers, people who've got a good idea and need to move it to the next step, but they don't want the big shed. The big shed for them doesn't work.
Yeah.
So absolutely getting close to the customer with more of this sort of urban, smaller type of activity. And the only way we can do that really is that shared resource pool, shared facility. It's a micro warehouse, as the article suggests.
Yes. Yeah. No, thank you, Vin. And James, are you seeing sort of any increasing demand in your world for customers wanting automation put into smaller city centre sites, or are those city centre sites, in your experience, just sort of kind of cross-docking sites rather than a fully fledged storage warehouse?
No, I'd say a bit of both. I think there's quite a few projects we've worked on recently where we're putting, it may not be an all-encompassing sort of approach, but one to a number of machines to fulfill a certain aspect or a certain number of products and goods which have to be delivered. It might be higher value goods, for example. But certainly on small scale, in more urban settings outside, in London and around the suburbs, for example, and as opposed to more, the big warehouse type stuff as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. Good. Well, let's move on now to the main subject. So the main topic being reimagining warehouse material handling systems and distribution centres. And the first question is sort of around, how do you select the right providers to help transform your warehouse operations? So I guess, there's different approaches. There can be the approach of saying, well, we'll work out in-house what we think we need, and then just go and talk to the specific companies who sell that equipment or system. Or it can be, let's get in the consultants and let them tell us everything, or a bit of a midway thing of calling expert firms like iForce who've got a lot of solutions expertise. Well, Nanda, what would be your advice or your experience of embarking on this sort of journey?
So I can quote from my experience, where we were successful and where we could have been more successful is when we try to reach out to finalize the partners. Sometimes the partners do not understand the objective, because the customers are not very clear in what they really need and what they are articulating, what their needs are. So the smart, successful partners are the one who really anticipate what's in it for the customer, what's the customer trying to do. So the best thing for the customer is not have any goods in the warehouse, but to have all the parts available at the place of requirement within no time. So that's a far-fetched requirement versus optimize inventory. So partners always come in with how do you move or pick and place your part, rather than look at the holistic picture of the customer as to what's the objective, what's their requirement, what's the process line, what's the throughput. So that's where we could have been more successful sometimes. But also the new trend is, I don't know if it's called that way. It's something like go to the person. So the goods to person, instead of instead of devising automation and things for people go and pick up, you can make sure that the goods come to the person where they need the parts. You're talking about an assembly line with multiple stations. You can devise your warehouse in such a way that, so thereby you're always taking out some kind of a working process which is under flow, and then you don't need so much of space in the warehouse. So you have a materials which is on a continuous flow. And this concept is applicable from consumable goods industry to any other manufacturing industries. I think I'm seeing that trend as a bit of increasing.
Okay.
From the previous vendor managed inventory concept to this is sort of gaining more importance.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. And Vin, in terms of sort of going about, choosing the right provider, I guess you see all sorts of ways that you get approached, from companies directly with no idea what they really want versus, consultants doing it on behalf of the company. What do you think works best in starting on that journey to find the right solution?
Where you can, if you've got a very clear understanding of what's the problem you're trying to solve. Sometimes a very open question of, I'd like you to take on my business, or it's sometimes people just cast the net out with a very wide scoping open question, and it takes a long time then to sort of boil down, well, what exactly is the problem that you're trying to solve? And even our experiences as iForce working with solution providers for things like robots and so on, you can ask them a very open question and it can take forever to get down to the actual solution that you're looking for. And my guidance would always be spend that time to think through what's the problem that you've got, and is it actually the problem that is manifesting itself, or is the problem that you're looking at really a symptom of something else? And get down to that root of the problem and understand what it is you're trying to solve, because then you know how to approach whoever you're going to talk to, be it a third-party service provider of services like iForce, or even iForce approaching automation providers. Having that very clear view just helps that conversation, and equally just helps the solution provider understand whether or not they can provide a solution. And as iForce's experience, we're quite open that says sometimes we just can't provide a solution to that problem, and we have to be very, very open about that. And we've had experiences with automation providers who've said, we just can't solve your problem. Maybe in a different time frame or in a different shape or scale, then the solution might work, but right now we can't. It's being very clear on that objective. What's the root of the problem you're trying to solve, and being very open in your discussions with whoever it is you're talking to.
That's really interesting advice. And James, and sort of at the receiving end of that sort of thing, how often do you have potential customers come along and say, I want you to quote for 3 of these machines, versus saying, here's my problem, what do you advise?
Probably, the nice ones are the ones who could come along and say, I want 3 of these machines, etc. but more likely it's this is my problem, or this is the problem I'm trying, or the challenges we have, and how best do we think we can sort of help them. I think very often customers or potential customers come in, they either have a good understanding of what they think they need to do, or they don't really have much of an idea. They just have their problem, and often the answer is sort of a bit of a sort of half and half. It might be somewhere in between. It's a very much a collaborative sort of partnership to come up with the best solution, I think, most of the time. But in terms of choosing the right partners and the right providers or service providers, I think finding somebody with the right attitude, and by the right attitude, I mean someone who's sort of they're flexible enough to deal with what you're trying to do and the things you're looking at, but they're able to provide the level of support you're going to need, and whether that's both in the short term for what the problem might be now, but also if it's a solution you're going to be putting in 10 years time, what does that look like, and are they able to scale up to deliver there and provide the support throughout.
That's a really interesting point you make, which will lead to our second sort of agenda item, and that is that sort of, I think historically the automation systems, they used to be 10, 20 years ago, were often very heavy duty fixed conveyors, very complex, a huge installation, and they take a long time to implement, a long time to spec, and therefore the whole process by the time, from starting to think of the journey to going live could be several years, in which case that future proofing is very difficult to achieve because everything's changed so much. But I think so moving to the second point, which is about introducing robotics and software systems to improve your distribution center. So on that, I mean, I guess, is robotics the answer these days, or are the sort of the more fixed systems that there used to be ancient history now? I mean, Nandri, I guess your products are rather different to the regular small consumer products. What are your thoughts on robotics versus previous systems?
No, automation has been a go-to solution in the industry which I'm in, and also heavy engineering and manufacturing. That's gaining more importance. We are now talking about AMRs, AGVs, and also even weathered solutions. So the trend is increasing. But the key lies in the remarks both from Vin and James about the partner being open enough to be honest and say what's their limitations and say this is not possible, and then the attitude which James said, that's very important, because the solution provider should be able to have the right attitude to see the difference between the effect of a problem on the warehouse versus the problem which could be lying elsewhere in the customer's end-to-end supply chain process. So they should be open enough to sort of guide the customer to see, hey, you're seeing the effect of your problem happening somewhere in the supply chain on your warehouse. So instead of finding a solution for that effect in the warehouse, let's look at how we can help you to tackle the problem so that the effect is minimized. So that's what is key to automation is good, but the key to solving the problem is much better.
Yeah.
And then especially in our industry, smelting and mining industry, this is very relevant.
Yeah.
You need to really look at the end-to-end process and value stream map and see what exactly is causing this effect at the warehouse or in the logistics or any other place. That's very important.
Okay, thank you, Vin. I know from having visited i4 sites that you've and it mentioned in your profile that you've been introducing the Exotech SkyPod system and the Locus robots. But for you, it's kind of quite interesting that you didn't implement that saying, right, we've got a client who needs something, let's install that for them. You really took a view to say what is going to be the right flexible solution for all sorts of clients for the coming years. So that must have been a very, very difficult decision. How did you make that decision about something as flexible as that?
Yeah, it's sort of taking that future look at, we know there's going to be challenges getting the right labour in the right place at the right time. So what should we do about it? And possibly slightly different from some other third-party providers, we sort of took a view of any operator like us, you need a warehouse and you need to have some racking or storage or whatever. So let's treat the automation a bit like the property. You've got to have it to make the whole service work. And then having invested the time and effort in implementing that, then it's really being able to have something that's flexible enough to adapt to lots of different clients' requirements and different solution needs. And things clients change over time. We've got a number of long-term clients for 20 years, 10 years or more. But again, clients change or their business profile changes. And some of the benefits of some of the new innovations that have been around particularly the last few years, particularly with something like Locus or something like Exotech's SkyPod solution. And there's many different options and variations of the same theme. There's a whole lot more flexibility now than some of the systems and fixed conveyor systems that I used to use in mail order, for example, back in the 90s and the 80s. Just some of the innovations now just bring a whole load more flexibility. Yeah.
Okay. So flexibility, obviously for your business particularly, it's really, really key. James, what are your thoughts on flexibility? Is robotics the only way to have flexibility where you can just buy another dozen robots when you're ready to, or do you think that it can be overrated compared to the efficiency of some other solutions?
No, I'm sure. I mean, I think robotics certainly have their place, and there's some great examples of robots running along tracks, picking. I think the development in the technology for the robots to capture what they're picking is an interesting area where they can visualize through a camera, on an individual sort of item basis, what needs to be picked and where that's going to be presented. I mean, our interactions mainly with robots have been more, say, in manufacturing, sales, etc., and materials handling, where we're presenting materials to robots, which will then pick that up and go and put it into machinery or into another element of the production phase, if you like. But I think robots certainly will have their place, and I don't think we'll have much choice. Not that they're taking over, but I think we need them.
Yeah. And sort of, yesterday we were talking as a sort of group. We were talking a little bit about the sort of robots and automation and the human side of things. Kind of, is it? I mean, we talked about labour shortages earlier. So are robots and automation a real threat to jobs, or actually there's just such a labour shortage that it's the only answer? I mean, what Nanda, what are your thoughts on the way that workers interact with automation?
I think the pace in which the industrialization is growing, I don't think there will be a competition between labor and automation. So I think both go hand in hand, because you're talking about using automation in areas where you do not want to encourage human beings to be open to any hazardous exposures, for example. That's a good way to implement automation. You're talking about using automation to run a warehouse 24/7, so continuous and get the repeatability, and if it's some heavy items to be moved or lifted across the warehouse. So if you design the solution in such a way that the automation complements the competent and talented labor we have, that would be that those industries will surely be very successful. And then the concept of the mindset of thinking labor versus automation, that should change. We should always look at complementing each other and making each other safe. So that kind of a hybrid will be the future, I think, in my opinion. Yeah.
Okay, no, thank you. And we got an interesting comment from Roman Butler. Roman, you've been putting some interesting comments and questions, and so just a very short, pithy one you've got there is their only threat, either the only threat of robots, is if workers won't adapt with their technology too. So I guess in a way that's sort of kind of what you're pointing at, Nanda, that it's important that the humans can adapt with the technology. And I guess, Vin, I know with the locust bots that they really do work alongside people, so they're not really sort of replacing them. They're just sort of saving a lot of the walking around. Was that when they're using those?
So all the jargon and terminology that's now creeping in. So they're sort of called cobots, collaborative bots. We have these little, someone dubbed them as little vacuum cleaners running around the warehouse, but it takes away the heavy, clunky effort away from people. And what we're finding is people are able to easily interact with the little iPad that's on the robot, even on the Exotech system. The people being easily interacting with the whole process just makes the whole thing a lot easier. So people coming in, they're all used to playing with the mobile phone, and they're the sort of comments we get from people. Oh, it's just like your phone. So
really
training time and getting people used to working with it. It's like, well, most people now have grown up with a phone. They've never not had a phone. So this stuff is just, whatever, as opposed to some of perhaps the older community like myself might be going, wow, this is really exciting. To a lot of younger people coming through, it's just, whatever. It's your stuff. You expect it almost.
Yeah. Okay. And James, I mean, obviously you've been in the automation field for a long time, setting aside robotics. You kind of, do people really like interacting with your machines? Do they on the whole take to it quite well?
Yeah, I think generally, I think initially it can be viewed, and sometimes people might have a negative opinion of automation in general because they see it as replacing people in the workplace, etc. But I agree with Nanda and Vin. It's very much about having a working together. I know that might sound a bit wishy-washy, but it's the best solution is about a bit of automation with people. People like to be I think there's an intangible benefit about working with technology, where you feel that you're being efficient and effective, and you're actually spending your time doing things worthwhile, rather than perhaps moving pallet trucks around the warehouse, etc., or pushing trolleys around to have some AMRs picking sections up and moving these around to feed people wherever they may be moved to in the warehouse. And so it's more about the displacement of people around an organization rather than replacement, I think. But certainly, yes, to answer your question, people, I think, really enjoy working with the machines, so much so that they have like a champion and people who take ownership of it, and there's a lot of pride in terms of using the machines and making sure people are using them correctly and getting the best out of them.
Yeah, no, great. And sort of thinking about, when we're talking about robotics and automation, and the wider issue of the distribution center, and we talked about property before. What sort of impact does this have on the types of property that are desirable? Because I mean, in the old days, it used to be just you want the biggest, tallest warehouse you can possibly have because you don't want to be walking around big distances. But now, if the travel can be done by robots and machines, then maybe a sort of low flat warehouse is better, and maybe is more likely to get planning permission. Nanda, what do you think? I mean, do you think the warehouse of the future will just look very different, even from the outside, to the warehouses we have now?
I think that if you look at the algorithm behind all this robots and AMRs, IGVs, the big change will come not from outside but from inside, because you need to have a bit of a consistency and a flow for these unmanned vehicles or machines to move around. You should be placing your objects in the right way in the same place for it to pick up, because there are certain limitations and definitions which come by when you start using automation. So the inside of the warehouse will be very much different, even though I don't know if the outside will be so much different as we see now, but inside will be very much different, and it will be more consistent. And that's the need of the automation, actually. That's the basic need of automation.
Yeah. Vin, what do you think? If I4 are looking for their next warehouse, will it be one of your typical 500,000 square foot beasts, or will it be a very different profile?
I think you're limited with what the property developers can do for you, and I think in the next sort of 10 to 20 years there may well be a step change as we start to imagine the future. But I think in the sort of short to medium term, with the property that's already there, there's almost like a prototype of what these properties look like, and it's how you can utilize things like autonomous forklift trucks. You can have very high racking, but there again, not all retailers' activities need high racking. So they are coming from the days of mail order. We worked in 2 cotton mills because they had 6 floors. They were like multi-floored, low-level types of activities.
Yeah.
In one of our own sites in the Corby area, we've sort of replicated that concept of multi-floors. So it's more like the old style cotton mill for smaller types of clients. So I don't think there's no silver bullet within all of this. And it's that as you imagine the future and what the technology that's going to emerge that we've not even thought of yet, what might that look like? I think there certainly will be redesign of property at some point. But right now, there's a lot of property that's out there already built.
That's true. The pipeline's
still there in the old sort of style of, sort of transport type of bulk warehouses. So I think we've got to work our way through that transition as we start to imagine the future.
Yeah, and as you say, property is a long lead time. And James, actually, I'll sort of introduce to James a sort of just another factor. And when I think of property searches I've done in warehouse searches in the past few years, often the biggest thing of all is like, has it got enough parking space? Because you need so many people, and everyone's got a car nowadays because cars are very affordable. And whether we all go to electric cars or not, that'll bring another challenge of how do you have the charging points. But I mean, it does mean that actually, what used to be it can be that automation can reduce the workforce and therefore suddenly make some buildings viable for customers, which weren't viable before. So I guess question for you, James, is do you ever get customers saying, look, we really want to kind of reduce the workforce because we've got to do more in our warehouse, and we can't have more people because there's nowhere for them to park and get here. Is that sometimes an issue?
I mean, it may well be an issue. I think customers generally would be very hesitant to say that they want to reduce the workforce. It's something I think they're very cagey about repeating, even though we do know sometimes that might be one of the main objectives. And certainly, as you say, they're visiting lots of these urban locations where they're actually parking is a major issue. So much so you even have to park off site somewhere and get buses in, etc. And the company will put on a bus to take you certainly to some of the larger sites. But I'm pleased you didn't ask me about whether or not there was going to be a trend away from high, tall buildings, because I'm really hoping that's not the case.
Because that's one of your specialities to make the best use of those, isn't it? Yeah, and Roman Butler, some more interesting comments from you, Roman. Yeah, Roman saying that parking spots anywhere had got to be the biggest issue he's ever encountered. That parking issue. And I know, Vin, that you sometimes have to bus in people from long distances when it comes to peak times. Yeah. Okay, let's move now to the third point we had, which we may have partly covered, but it's really talking about emerging technology in the materials handling industry and identifying what works for you. So I guess, yeah, what do you think are the biggest drivers of automation, Nanda? If there's one single driver you think is the biggest one to make, because it can be that it's just cost cutting of people, or it can be I just need the capacity and I can pick an awful lot more with automation than I can with a workforce. What do you think are the biggest drivers that you're seeing?
I would say two actually. One is maybe one. I would say efficiency is one of the biggest driver. Not to be rude against any labor workforce, but efficiency is one of the biggest driver for automation. That's how these things started. And of course, the other thing was health and safety. So health and safety in terms of industries, especially coming from chemical industries and pharmaceutical industries. So there it was made as a complement to protect the labor workforce. Automation is started sort of birth of this automation started from those kind of need, but it's growing very fast.
That's a very interesting point.
I was just imagining, your previous questions about what would be the warehouse, and we were talking about the warehouse, parking space, etc. But I would imagine warehouses which can be built under subsea. So we'll be soon seeing warehouses and storages within the subsea. That means sea level is about 3,000 meters, and then you go below the sea level, and you can have a warehouse within the subsea structure. You can build warehouses in the space.
Yeah.
So we can imagine those kind of things, because the land available for development versus the land available for the ever so growing population. So I'm very sure the population will win the race, and then all of the rest land will be thrown out. So we have no land to keep items and materials. So it has to be either below the sea or above the space. So then we are talking about completely different. If you can imagine, this will happen very soon. We are talking about for example, if you talk about storage of some hydrogen, for example, everybody wants to use hydrogen as a material. So how will you store? So best way, it has to be under pressure. So best way is to store it below the subsea level. So you have storage bunker inside the seabed. And that's a different warehouse. Yeah.
Well, it's a really interesting point. I don't know if any of you on the panel, and certainly in the audience, a few years ago, Amazon had taken out a patent for storing goods underwater, literally in lakes. And the idea was they'd be sealed in containers of some kind, which had weights in, and then the containers would drop to the bottom of this lake bed. And then when you wanted to retrieve the product, it would just inflate and sort of an air bladder, and that particular product would float up to the surface. They literally did bring out a patent. So they certainly are very imaginative in thinking about how can you avoid the cost of a huge building and of racking and alternative ways. Look, who knows if it will ever go anywhere, but 20 years ago, who would have dreamt that drones could be a potential part of supply chains? And certainly, Nanda, you make a really good point on the health and safety. And when I think of warehouses I visited over the years, some of them you think, God, this is dangerous, with people driving way too quickly on forklift trucks, not putting on their seatbelts on the forklift trucks, things like that. So you certainly, automating it and having self-driving kind of materials handling, vehicles can certainly reduce some of that human risk there.
Yes.
Vin, over to you. What are your thoughts on what are the big drivers of what work, to choose what works best for you as a business?
Yeah, I think key thing for us has always been the flexibility and also the scalability of the solutions. And is it repeatable? So if we've got multiple warehouses, can we repeat the solution in more than one warehouse, or is it something that's just too bespoke? So we've sort of focused our attention on a number of solutions, and not just saying this is one single solution, the silver bullet that's going to fix everything. And also we've got to be thinking about the cost viability of all of these solutions. And very often in the past, you can look at a cost justification of a single project, and over the term that you might have with a client contract, it will never work. It will never pay its way. And it's got to have that very long-term view. And again, even if taking that long-term view, sometimes the automation solutions that you need don't necessarily pay back all of the direct labor. So it's not necessarily a question or a judgment on, does it save me labor, but does it make my labor, or does it make the activity more attractive to the labor? Is it a safer work environment? Is it a good place to work? And is it nice and safe?
Yeah.
But one of the other sort of key spin-offs, I suppose, now with the emerging technology like robots and so on, what we've found is the accessibility to the height. So if we need pick faces, typically they needed to be accessible by a pedestrian. You might step on a truck, but you step on a truck, you might fall off. Yeah. And you might go up to, say, 2 meters high. And now with the technology that can go up in the air for you and bring stuff to you, you can now have probably in a quarter of the space that you used to have for a pick face, you can now have far much more going on.
Yes.
So, but the cost of that equipment and technology and so on may not save you so much direct labor benefit, but it does help you retain your staff and provides a much safer environment, and you get the benefit on the property saving because you're not occupying so much space. So there's almost like a Rubik cube of things that you need to evaluate in this whole thing.
Yeah, and you're right. It's often not just one thing, and that property one. I'm thinking, James, it's a nice introduction, James, to what your systems do, which is really making use of height. And certainly there was a project we actually worked on a few years ago where it actually wasn't just a property saving, but it meant that the business didn't have to move to a bigger warehouse. So that was like an absolutely huge benefit. So James, for you, what do you see as the biggest drivers of your customers and the companies you talk to?
Well, probably I'd say maybe there's three, and when we have exhibitions, for example, probably the three different things and challenges people have. One is speed of picking, so how many items or how many order lines can I pick in an hour, example. So they have speed issues. They want to ramp up how quickly they can pick. Space and a shortage of space in the warehouse, as per the example we worked on previously. People have challenges. They're trying to either fit whatever they can into the box they have, or perhaps looking into a new warehouse, how best to lay that out, and therefore what systems would they need in there to again maximize the footprint that's available. And the other one is probably on going down the health and safety road. Really, it's materials handling and picking. People storing engines, for example, and on all sorts of different materials and quirky objects, etc. How best are we to deliver them to an operator for them to then handle that and move that in and out of some sort of system to get it to where it needs to be? And while we generally focus on the providing the space, the storage solution or whatever that may be, most of the time it's probably spent on the before and after, actually, how we get things in and how we get them out in a safe way, which is limiting any risk or all those sorts of things.
Great, thank you. So lots of common kind of drivers and some individual ones you brought in. Thank you. And a final question, because we need to sort of close off in a moment or two. So a final one, which is a really interesting question from Arvind Raja, which is looking ahead. What are the biggest blockers for automation? So Nanda, what do you think is the biggest blocker for automation?
Yeah, I would say the mindset and also the understanding of the total cost. When you're talking about automation, you're talking about total cost of ownership than total cost of acquisition. So if you look at the total cost of ownership and then you realize your solution, automation as a solution is not covering up your entire scope, it's only part of your scope, then that becomes a liability cost than a solution cost. And then people are more discouraged, and then you don't have encouraging comments about how you're automizing and how you're able to get the benefits out of it, because it's us to blame because we didn't do our homework properly, we did not estimate correctly. And so I think that's what I've been hearing when people talk about automation. They talk about cost and they say, oh, I don't think we made the right decision, we're not getting the returns in, because the solution is not based upon the total cost of ownership needs. I think that's the biggest blocker.
Okay, interesting. And also I did like the point you made about mindset as well. Vin, what do you reckon might be the biggest blockers to automation going forward?
I'd echo what Nanda's just said there. It is all about mindset in my experience. And, if you are simply focused on it's a cost, I've been through those experiences in, third-party logistics. You can never justify it when you look at cost. We've now changed a mindset in our business to take a holistic view of it's not just about cost. It's about a whole bunch of different things about property, space, flexibility, scalability, retaining people, making it an attractive place to work, and so on. So it's definitely a mindset.
Very interesting. Okay, and James, what's the thing that most gets you when an opportunity falls through and the customer says, no, we're not going to go ahead after all?
Generally, probably cost. I'd say cost and mindset, and perhaps I'll put it down to us maybe not getting over or helping them to appreciate the benefits of investment in such technology and the impact that can have. Because lots of the impacts are those intangible things, because you can't really measure how much enjoyment people get from technology. There's no, apart from perhaps looking at staff retention, etc. So it is, I'd say, definitely the biggest hurdle is just cost of automation. But actually, for our stuff anyway, it's relatively low compared to some of the bigger robot systems, etc.
No, great. Okay, well, thank you very much. That's some really great insights and shared experience from all of you. I've got to make the difficult decision of who should get the Supply Chain Talk mug. And while Roman, I know we've had lots of great comments from you, I'm going to today just pick out Arvind for his very interesting final question there. So Arvind Raja, thank you very much for your question. A Supply Chain Talk mug will find its way to you. And a reminder that our next episode really follows on very naturally from this one, because we talked about it a little bit, which is how is supply chain technology impacting talent retention? So we talked about the pros and cons of technology, so that's a really nice follow-on. But the guests are already taken, so we can't have the three of you back next week, I'm afraid. But that is next week on the 10th of May at 4 p.m. UK time, so same time in a week's time. And so finally, thank you very much for my three guests. Nanda Kishore, Head of Global Supply Chain at Eramet Titanium and Iron. Vin Granger, Solutions Director with iForce, and James Roberts, Director at Randex Limited. So thank you all three of you, and thank you, audience, for all your comments and questions, and see you next week.